The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the small-town courtroom, casting a golden glow over polished wooden benches and the solemn faces of those gathered. Judge Thompson, a man known for his stern demeanor yet fair judgment, sat behind the bench, shuffling papers and preparing to call the session to order. The air was thick with quiet anticipation. A case involving theft and fraud had drawn a small crowd, locals curious about the proceedings, law enforcement officers, and a few reporters scribbling in their notepads. No one noticed the tiny observer quietly perched on her mother's lap, her legs dangling, her small fingers tapping against the polished wood. Ella was barely 3 years old. She had wide brown eyes, a mess of curly hair, and a curiosity that seemed larger than her tiny frame. Today she was dressed in a soft pink dress, a little cardigan, and tiny shoes that clicked against the wooden floor as she shifted impatiently. Her mother, Mrs. Reynolds, tried to keep her calm, whispering gently, "Sit still, honey. We're here to watch, remember." But Ella's attention was already elsewhere. Her eyes were fixed on a large, majestic figure sitting near the front of the courtroom, a police dog. Rex, a German shepherd with a glossy coat and sharp, intelligent eyes, sat beside his handler, Officer Davis. His posture was perfect, disciplined, yet there was a warmth in his expression, a subtle awareness of everyone in the room. Ella was immediately drawn to him, her tiny hand lifting slightly as if she wanted to reach out. Rex wasn't just any dog. He had been trained for years in the art of detection, obedience, and protection. He had sniffed out contraband in countless raids, assisted in arrests, and his keen instincts had saved officers from dangerous situations more than once. He was calm now, but his presence alone commanded respect. The adults in the courtroom paid him little attention, focused instead on the trial at hand, but Ella sensed something different. As Judge Thompson tapped the gavel, calling the court to order, Ella whispered to her mother, "Big dog, look at him." Mrs. Reynolds chuckled softly, adjusting Ella on her lap. "Yes, he's very brave, sweetheart." But Ella didn't seem satisfied with a simple answer. Her eyes followed every subtle movement, the twitch of Rex's ears when a witness spoke, the shift of his weight as the attorneys presented evidence, the way his tail remained almost imperceptibly swaying, a silent signal of his alertness. The trial began formally. The attorneys spoke in measured tones, presenting the case. Stolen property, eyewitness accounts, and evidence linking the defendant, a man in his late 30s with nervous hands and shifting eyes, to the crime. The courtroom was tense. Jurors sat upright, their eyes flicking from witness to evidence, occasionally glancing at the defendant. Reporters scribbled furiously, and spectators whispered quietly amongst themselves. Yet through all this, Ella remained focused on Rex. She leaned forward slightly, tilting her head, watching the dog. The way he sat, perfectly still yet attentive, fascinated her. Her small mind noticed details no one else seemed to see. How he scanned the room subtly, how he seemed to sense emotions, how he reacted ever so slightly when someone lied or hesitated. It was as if she could see his thoughts, or perhaps as if he could see hers. Ella's mother tried to gently redirect her attention to the trial, pointing toward the witness stand. "Honey, look at the lady talking," she whispered. But Ella's gaze returned to Rex. She whispered again, almost to herself, "He's watching everything." Mrs. Reynolds smiled nervously, unsure whether to be amused or slightly concerned at her daughter's keen observation. The defendant's lawyer rose to question a witness. Ella tilted her head, listening to the words and the subtle body language, then glanced at Rex. The dog's eyes followed the witness, then flicked toward the defendant. Ella noticed the slight tension in Rex's posture, a shift that went unnoticed by the adults. She pointed subtly at him, whispering to her mother, "He knows." Mrs. Reynolds nearly choked on her tea of surprise. "Who knows what, honey?" she whispered, but Ella's focus never wavered. The courtroom seemed unaware of this tiny exchange, absorbed in the seriousness of the trial. Officers murmured quietly among themselves, the judge reviewed documents, and the attorneys continued their arguments. Yet for a moment the room's atmosphere subtly shifted. There was a quiet energy, a feeling that something unseen was being observed, a presence that brought calm yet commanded attention. Rex was more than a police dog here. He was a silent observer, a guardian, and perhaps an unspoken witness. Ella's fascination grew with every passing minute. She watched as witnesses recounted their experiences, noting the slight inconsistencies in their gestures, the nervous glances toward the defendant. The adults only saw words. Ella saw patterns, watched responses, and felt the energy in the room. Rex, seemingly aware of the tension, adjusted slightly, his ears twitching, eyes narrowing as he followed the subtle cues. Ella's small hand lifted again, almost in greeting, almost in acknowledgement, as though recognizing a silent bond between child and dog. By mid-morning, whispers and notes were passed among the media and court attendees, commenting on the remarkable dog. Police dog's presence calming the courtroom, one reporter scribbled. Rex remains perfectly attentive, another noted. But Ella's mother realized that her daughter's fascination was deeper than admiration. The little girl had a perception, an innate understanding that went beyond casual interest. She had already spoken 2 words that carried weight beyond her years. As the first witness concluded, Ella shifted, leaning closer to her mother. "He sees," she whispered, voice barely audible but filled with certainty. Mrs. Reynolds looked down, puzzled. "Sees what, sweetie?" But Ella didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on Rex, watching every twitch, every blink, every movement. She understood something the adults couldn't. This dog wasn't just part of the courtroom, he was part of the truth. The session continued, but the subtle tension persisted. Every participant felt, in ways they could not explain, the quiet presence of both child and dog. Ella's innocent fascination and Rex's trained vigilance intertwined, creating a silent narrative that no one in the courtroom could fully comprehend. And though no one yet realized it, the words Ella would speak next would shift the room forever, marking a moment that would be remembered, retold, and cherished for years to come. The courtroom settled into a tense rhythm as the trial continued. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting the events of a burglary that had rattled the quiet town. Each story was precise, full of dates, times, and details that painted a clear picture of the crime. Yet for Ella, the words were background noise. Her wide eyes, barely 3 years old, remained glued to Rex, the German shepherd who sat beside his handler, Officer Davis. His presence was steady, commanding attention even without movement. Every twitch of his ears, every flick of his eyes, every subtle change in posture seemed to speak directly to Ella. While the adults were absorbed in legal arguments, Ella's mind was observing patterns they could not see. She noticed how Rex's gaze tracked not just the witnesses, but the reactions of the defendant. When the defense attorney asked pointed questions, the man shifted in his seat. A bead of sweat ran down his temple, unnoticed by most, but Rex's ears twitched at the slightest hint of deception. Ella leaned forward, her tiny hand brushing against her mother's arm as if she, too, was sensing the weight in the room. The first witness, a local store clerk, described a suspicious man loitering near the premises days before the theft. Ella's gaze followed every motion of the clerk's hands, every hesitation in her words. She noticed the subtle glance toward the defendant, the slight tightening of lips. Rex seemed to notice too. He tilted his head slightly, sniffed the air, and shifted his weight. Ella whispered softly, almost reverently, "He's watching him." Her mother looked down, startled. "Watching who, honey?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ella said nothing, simply pointing to Rex, her eyes wide with certainty. As the second witness, a neighbor who had seen the defendant near the scene, gave testimony, Ella's fascination grew. She leaned further forward, her small fingers curling around the edge of the wooden bench. Rex remained steady, but his eyes scanned the room, catching the subtlest movements. He was calm but alert, sensing things the humans overlooked. Ella's whispers became more frequent, words forming in her mind that she wasn't yet ready to voice aloud. "He knows," she murmured again, her voice just above a breath. Mrs. Reynolds's heart skipped a beat. She smiled nervously, unsure whether her daughter understood what she was saying. The courtroom buzzed quietly as reporters scribbled notes. Some spectators had begun to notice the unusual bond forming between child and dog. A few smiled softly, whispering about how children often notice things adults miss. Officer Davis, Rex's handler, noticed Ella too. He observed her intense focus, the way her tiny body leaned toward Rex as if she could communicate silently with him. A flicker of admiration crossed his face. Children often saw the world differently, he thought, and perhaps this child saw something important. The defendant, a man in his late 30s with dark circles under his eyes, fidgeted nervously. He tried to remain composed, answering the attorney's questions with forced calm, but he couldn't escape the feeling that someone or something was observing him closely. His gaze flicked toward Rex briefly and he shivered. There was no logical reason for a child to unsettle him, and yet he felt exposed. The air in the courtroom thickened with tension, unnoticed by most but palpable to Ella. Her instincts told her that Rex understood something about the man, something the humans had overlooked. The judge called for a short recess, giving the jury a moment to step out and discuss. Ella wriggled on her mother's lap, clearly eager to return to the scene. She whispered again, "He sees everything." Mrs. Reynolds leaned closer, unsure what her daughter meant, but there was no time for explanation. Rex remained seated, watching the room, his eyes scanning every face, every gesture. Even in the brief pause, there was a sense that the dog was attuned to more than just the trial. He was sensing truths hidden beneath words. When the trial resumed, the defense attorney introduced a piece of evidence, a security camera video from the night of the theft. The footage played on a small screen near the front of the room. The defendant sat rigidly, watching as his movements were displayed in grainy black and white. Ella's eyes widened. She leaned forward, pointing at Rex, who tilted his head as the video played. "He knows," she whispered again, louder this time. The words drew curious glances from those nearby. Officer Davis's hand tightened on Rex's leash subtly, nodding the child's insistence. The video was clear. The defendant had been in the vicinity of the stolen items, but his expression and body language on tape told a deeper story. Rex's reactions were subtle but telling. A slight tension in his body, ears adjusting, a small inhale through his nose. Ella watched intently. To her, it was clear. Rex understood the truth, even if the humans hadn't fully grasped it yet. She felt a strange confidence that this dog, so disciplined and intelligent, was a silent witness to things no one else could see. As the testimony continued, the courtroom's attention shifted slightly. Observers whispered about the dog's calm presence, his ability to remain composed yet alert. A few reporters made notes about the unusual dynamic between the child and the police dog. The defendant shifted nervously again, glancing at Rex, sensing the dog's awareness. Ella noticed the reaction immediately. She whispered urgently, "He knows what he did." Her mother's hand tightened around hers. The words hung in the air, drawing curious looks from the front rows. The next witness was an officer who had investigated the theft. He spoke of small details, footprints, fingerprints, items found in suspicious locations. As he recounted the investigation, Rex's ears twitched, his gaze fixed on the defendant. Ella noticed every subtle movement. "He sees it all," she murmured, almost as if sharing a secret with her mother. Mrs. Reynolds couldn't suppress a small shiver. The precision with which her daughter observed the dog and the defendant was uncanny. By mid-morning, a strange energy settled over the courtroom. Words were being spoken, evidence displayed, witnesses questioned, yet the room seemed to hold its breath in moments where Ella and Rex shared an unspoken understanding. The adults continued their formal proceedings, but the child and the dog created a silent narrative of their own. In those moments, the mundane legalities of the trial were secondary to an extraordinary bond. The keen instincts of a police dog and the sharp perceptions of a 3-year-old. As recess approached again, Ella's small hand reached for Rex's paw under the bench. She whispered softly, "He's not lying." Mrs. Reynolds looked down, heart racing. "Who's not lying, sweetheart?" she asked. Ella simply pointed, eyes wide and serious. "Him," she said. Her mother followed her gaze and saw Rex, calm but intensely aware. Officer Davis noticed the gesture and smiled faintly. There was an unspoken respect forming between child, dog, and handler. an acknowledgement that sometimes truth was sensed rather than spoken aloud. When the jury returned from recess, the courtroom fell silent once more. Ella, still perched on her mother's lap, was ready to watch again. Her tiny body seemed charged with anticipation. Every twitch of Rex's ears, every glance he cast, every subtle movement was noted. Ella's whispers were quiet but meaningful. "He knows, he saw it, he's smart." The adults continued the trial unaware, but a small audience in the courtroom, Ella and Rex, shared an understanding far beyond their years or experience. And though no one realized it yet, the words Ella would speak in the moments to come, the two words that seemed so simple, would shift the room's energy forever. The trial, serious and somber, had just become a stage for an extraordinary story, one in which a 3-year-old and a police dog would reveal truths that no one expected. The courtroom had fallen into a rhythm of quiet anticipation. Witnesses gave their testimonies with precise wording, lawyers argued with careful rhetoric, and the jury listened intently. But in one small corner of the room, a far more unusual observation was unfolding. Ella, perched on her mother's lap, had been watching Rex intently for hours. Her wide brown eyes had followed every movement, every twitch of his ears, every subtle shift of his powerful German Shepherd frame. She understood in her own small but perceptive way that Rex was more than a dog. He was a sentinel, a guardian of truths invisible to the human eye. The defendant shifted nervously in his chair, glancing once toward Rex, who remained alert but calm. The man's eyes flicked back to the witness stand, but the subconscious feeling of being observed had begun to gnaw at him. He was uncomfortable, though he didn't understand why. Most of the adults in the room were engrossed in the procedural details, focused on the facts of the case, the security footage and witness statements. But a child, barely 3 years old, had noticed something extraordinary. Ella's whispers had grown more frequent. "He sees everything," she murmured under her breath, leaning slightly forward. Her mother tried to hush her softly, worried about the child speaking out of turn, but there was an undeniable intensity in Ella's gaze. It was as if she could sense not just the trial but the truth behind it. Her small hand pointed again toward Rex, and she whispered louder this time, "He knows." At first, the words barely registered with the courtroom. Some of the nearby spectators glanced at each other and chuckled quietly, assuming it was the innocent babbling of a curious child. But then Ella repeated the words, this time with such clarity and confidence that even the judge paused mid-sentence. The gavel hovered in his hand as he looked down at the little girl. "He knows?" Judge Thompson asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and amusement. Ella nodded vigorously, her eyes wide, unwavering. The courtroom went still. Attorneys froze mid-gesture. The defendant's jaw tightened, and for the first time he felt exposed in a way that words alone could not explain. He glanced at Rex, his gaze meeting the dog's intelligent eyes. Rex remained calm, but the subtle tension in his stance mirrored the unease that had begun to ripple through the room. Officer Davis, the handler, took note. Children often observed what adults overlooked, he thought, but this was something different. There was an understanding between this tiny observer and his dog that transcended words. A whisper ran through the spectators. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, unsure whether to write down a 3-year-old's comment verbatim or dismiss it as an amusing aside. Jurors exchanged glances, puzzled and intrigued. Even the witnesses paused, sensing that the words of this child might carry weight beyond their literal meaning. The atmosphere of the courtroom shifted. What had begun as a standard theft trial now felt infused with a quiet, almost mystical energy. Ella's mother, Mrs. Reynolds, was both proud and nervous. She leaned down, whispering, "Honey, what do you mean?" But Ella didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on Rex, her tiny fingers pointing steadily at him. Her words had already spoken more than she could explain. There was a knowing, a perception that no adult in the room yet understood. To her, the dog was a witness, a silent participant in the truth of what had transpired. The defendant's lawyer tried to regain composure, adjusting papers in front of him and clearing his throat. "Your Honor, may we proceed?" he asked. The judge nodded, though his eyes lingered on Ella and Rex. "Proceed," he said, but there was a subtle curiosity in his voice, a recognition that something extraordinary had just occurred. The courtroom had become a stage not only for legal argument but for a moment of human and animal perception intersecting in an unexpected way. Rex shifted slightly, a movement so minor that many adults would have missed it. His ears twitched. His nose lifted just enough to catch the faintest scent of tension from the defendant. Ella noticed immediately. She whispered, "He's sure." Her voice was clear now, confident, and for the first time those two words felt like a verdict in themselves. There was no confusion in her mind. The dog, trained and intelligent, had recognized something crucial, and this tiny child understood it. The judge leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed, intrigued. "And who exactly knows what, young lady?" he asked, trying to keep a serious tone while suppressing the curiosity he could not ignore. Ella's answer was simple but profound. She pointed at Rex, her voice steady. "Him," she said. 2 words. That was all. The courtroom fell silent again, this time in full attention as the weight of those words settled over everyone present. The implication was clear, though subtle. This dog, in his calm, disciplined way, had witnessed and understood truths that humans could not immediately grasp. The defendant's eyes widened slightly. He tried to maintain composure, but the sense of being observed, of being understood in ways he could not control, was unnerving. He looked once more at Rex, whose calm presence seemed to convey awareness without judgment. Officer Davis quietly patted Rex's shoulder, signaling that the dog had done nothing unusual, yet the tension in the room spoke volumes. The power of perception, it seemed, could come in many forms: human, animal, and in this case, childlike insight. Witnesses who had been nervous before felt a subtle shift. There was a sense that the courtroom was not merely filled with people watching people, but that something greater was observing and interpreting the events. The jurors exchanged glances again, noting the unusual dynamic. The atmosphere was no longer purely about legal evidence. There was a story unfolding beneath the surface, one of instincts, perception, and silent acknowledgement. The trial, serious as it was, had gained an unexpected element: the insight of a child and the knowledge of a police dog. Ella's mother felt a mix of pride and nervousness. She leaned closer, whispering, "That's incredible, honey, you're very smart." Ella merely nodded, eyes still locked on Rex. Her small hand lifted again, almost in recognition, almost in gratitude. In that moment it became clear that the courtroom had witnessed something remarkable: a 3-year-old and a police dog, united in understanding, conveying a truth that transcended human language. The media outside the courthouse would later describe the moment as extraordinary, dubbing it the 2 words that silenced a courtroom. But inside, it was simple, almost pure. A child recognized the awareness of a dog trained to protect and serve, and she acknowledged it openly. The judge, the attorneys, and the spectators felt the impact, even if they could not yet articulate it. The quiet understanding between Ella and Rex had transformed the room, adding a layer of tension, respect, and curiosity that words alone could not convey. As the trial resumed, the courtroom remained charged. Witnesses continued their statements, evidence was presented, but the memory of those 2 words lingered. The defendant shifted uneasily, aware that his every movement was being observed not just by humans but by a keenly perceptive animal, and a child who seemed to understand far more than her age suggested. The trial, already serious and consequential, had taken on an almost surreal quality. Even as proceedings continued, whispers circulated quietly. Some spectators speculated on the uncanny insight of a child, others marveled at the intelligence of Rex. But all shared the same sentiment: the courtroom had experienced something rare, a moment where innocence and trained instinct intersected to reveal truths otherwise hidden. And Ella, perched on her mother's lap, remained calm, focused, and fully aware that she had observed something remarkable, and that the dog beside her had validated it. The courtroom had grown strangely quiet after Ella's words. "He knows." 2 small words from a 3-year-old had rippled through the room like a stone tossed into still water, creating waves of curiosity, tension, and awe. Judge Thompson adjusted his glasses, leaned forward on the bench, and regarded the child intently. The courtroom staff and attendees sensed a subtle shift. Something remarkable had happened. Everyone, even those focused on procedural matters, felt the weight of the moment. Rex sat quietly beside Officer Davis, yet his presence was now magnified. Every twitch of his ears, every subtle shift in posture seemed to carry meaning. Spectators noticed it. The way his eyes followed the defendant, the small inhale through his nose, the slight flex of his muscles. The adults, who had spent hours dissecting words and evidence, now realized that this dog was more than a passive observer. He was an active participant in perception, in the reading of human behavior, in the silent assessment of truth. The defendant, a man in his late 30s with dark hair and restless eyes, shifted uncomfortably. He had thought he could control the courtroom, focus on the legal arguments, and present a confident front. Yet now, under the combined gaze of a child and a trained police dog, he felt exposed. There was no direct accusation, no threat, but the sense of awareness was undeniable. His palms grew slightly clammy, and he adjusted his tie nervously, glancing at Rex as though the dog could read every secret thought. Attorneys paused mid-gesture. The prosecution and defense exchanged glances, recognizing that something unusual was unfolding. The court reporter scribbled furiously, unsure whether to record the incident in formal notes. Even the jury, composed of local townspeople accustomed to the quiet formality of legal proceedings, felt the shift. Whispers of curiosity passed silently among them. They exchanged subtle looks, each member wondering if the child had truly noticed something profound, or if it was simply the innocence of a toddler projecting imagination onto a dog. Officer Davis, Rex's handler, watched the child with growing fascination. He had trained dogs for over a decade and witnessed countless human reactions to law enforcement animals, but he had never observed a child interact in such a focused and perceptive way. Ella's attention was unwavering, her gaze fixed on Rex as if she were reading his thoughts. Her small hands rested lightly on her mother's lap, occasionally pointing, occasionally gesturing, but her eyes told a story of understanding that belied her age. The first ripple of tension came when a witness, testifying about evidence linking the defendant to the scene, noticed Ella pointing. "What's she pointing at?" the witness whispered to her neighbor. The neighbor shrugged, murmuring, "Just a child, I guess." But the witness couldn't ignore the intensity in Ella's expression, or the calm focus of the dog beside her. It was as if the child had unveiled a hidden observer, one capable of seeing beyond human words. The media present in the courtroom sensed a story unfolding. Reporters exchanged quiet comments. "Did you see the girl pointing at the dog?" "Yeah, and she said something like, 'He knows.'" Typing on laptops, they recorded every detail, knowing that this unusual interaction could capture national attention. The simple, unassuming words of a toddler suddenly carried weight far beyond the courtroom. Social media posts would later label the moment, "a 3-year-old who saw the truth." Back on the bench, Judge Thompson cleared his throat. He had spent years presiding over cases and thought he had seen everything, yet he found himself intrigued. He leaned toward the clerk, whispering just loud enough for a few nearby jurors to hear. "Remarkable. What do you make of that?" His comment, though private, underscored the subtle tension now palpable in the courtroom. The trial itself continued, yet every statement and movement seemed to be filtered through the lens of that extraordinary child-dog moment. The defendant's lawyer tried to regain control of the proceedings. "Your Honor, may we proceed with the next witness?" he asked, attempting to mask unease. Judge Thompson nodded slowly, but the unusual energy in the room lingered. The defendant, seated rigidly, shifted once more, feeling the weight of unseen scrutiny. His mind raced, recalling every detail of the crime and how evidence could be interpreted. He felt as though Rex and perhaps even Ella could see his inner thoughts. It was an unsettling feeling, one that made his confident facade waver. As the next witness approached the stand, a security officer involved in the investigation, Ella leaned forward again. Her small voice, barely audible, whispered, "He's sure." Mrs. Reynolds held her breath, unsure whether to intervene. But Ella's confidence was remarkable. She had watched the dog, noted his subtle signals, and interpreted them with clarity far beyond her years. The courtroom seemed to slow around her, the rhythm of speech and movement taking a backseat to this quiet, extraordinary observation. The witness, unaware of the child's presence, continued to describe details of the crime. He spoke of footprints, surveillance footage, and objects recovered from the scene. To the adults, it was routine testimony, procedural and necessary. To Ella, it was part of a larger puzzle, one that Rex was quietly validating with every subtle adjustment of his body. Her tiny hand pointed again, and she whispered to her mother, "He knows everything." Mrs. Reynolds' heart raced. She couldn't explain the accuracy, only marvel at the child's perception. Observers began to take note of the dynamic. Some parents in the room smiled softly, recognizing the innocence and keen observation of children. A few jurors whispered quietly, their curiosity piqued. The defendant's discomfort grew with each passing moment, a silent acknowledgement that something larger than the written evidence was at play. It was a rare instance when the courtroom, a space usually dominated by adults, legal codes, and procedure, became the stage for a subtle yet powerful interplay between perception, intuition, and truth. The ripple effect spread further when Rex moved slightly, leaning in just enough to sniff the air and shift his gaze toward the defendant. It was an almost imperceptible motion, but Ella noticed. She whispered again, her voice clear and deliberate, "He knows what he did." A hush fell over those seated closest to her. Officer Davis's hand tightened on the leash, acknowledging the dog's instinctive awareness. The courtroom's rhythm of human words and legal procedure had now been infused with silent observation and perception that no one could ignore. Even the judge found himself reflecting, recognizing the rare nature of the moment. Years of presiding over trials had shown him deception, guilt, and innocence, but rarely had a courtroom witnessed the combined insight of a child and a police dog. The jury leaned in, subtle curiosity on their faces. Every movement, every whisper, every glance between Ella and Rex became part of the unspoken narrative unfolding beneath the official record of the trial. The defendant's eyes darted from the witness to Rex, then back to Ella. There was an unsettling sense of exposure he could not articulate. Words alone could not convey the awareness that had taken root in the room. For the first time, he felt observed in a way that transcended normal courtroom scrutiny. The energy was quiet but intense, a tension that made even seasoned officers and lawyers pause, if only briefly, to acknowledge the extraordinary presence of both child and dog. Ella remained calm, her eyes bright with comprehension. She understood what Rex's subtle cues meant. She didn't fully articulate it in words beyond her brief whispers, but the clarity in her gaze and her gestures communicated volumes. It was as though she and the dog shared a secret, a silent understanding that no adult could fully grasp. Her 2 words earlier, "He knows," now reverberated through the courtroom in the minds of those who had heard them, and even those who hadn't yet processed them fully. By mid-afternoon, the ripple effect was undeniable. Observers whispered to one another, reporters scribbled notes, and even the most hardened courtroom attendees felt a quiet awe. The proceedings continued, but the child-dog connection had introduced a new dimension to the trial, one in which perception, innocence, and instinct carried as much weight as spoken evidence. The defendant shifted again, realizing, with a sinking feeling, that the courtroom was no longer merely filled with humans passing judgment. The trial pressed on, but the ripple effect lingered. Witnesses were aware of the subtle presence, jurors remembered the child's observation, and spectators carried a new sense of wonder. The courtroom, serious and procedural, had become a theater for something extraordinary, and Ella, perched on her mother's lap, continued to watch, whisper, and observe, knowing that in her innocence she had noticed the truth. While the courtroom buzzed quietly with speculation, the history of Rex, the German shepherd who had captured the attention of a 3-year-old, began to emerge in subtle ways. Officer Davis, noticing the unusual attention the dog was receiving, leaned down and whispered to a reporter nearby, careful to maintain courtroom decorum. "Rex isn't just any dog," he said. "He's been on the force for over 5 years. He's trained in detection, search and rescue, and officer protection. He's solved cases that might have gone cold if not for his instincts." Rex's story was impressive, even by police standards. Born and raised in a rigorous training program, he had been selected as a puppy for his calm demeanor, intelligence, and ability to focus under pressure. From the moment he could walk, trainers worked to develop his senses, teaching him to distinguish scents in chaotic environments, to remain composed amidst loud noises, and to react to subtle cues in human behavior. His ability to sense danger and deceit had made him a favorite among officers who relied on his silent judgment in situations where words could not convey truth. Ella, though unaware of the technicalities of Rex's training, had an instinctive understanding of him. Her childlike perception allowed her to notice what adults overlooked: the way Rex's ears twitched at the faintest changes in the defendant's behavior, the subtle shifting of his weight as if responding to a hidden signal, the way his eyes followed patterns invisible to human observers. To Ella, these movements weren't just animal reflexes. They were signs of understanding, of awareness, of intelligence that transcended the ordinary. As Officer Davis recalled Rex's pass to the courtroom staff quietly, the dog remained alert but calm. There was a certain dignity in his posture, a quiet confidence that had been honed through years of training and service. He had been part of narcotics investigations, missing person searches, and high-risk arrests. In one notable case, he had located a child lost in the woods for nearly 12 hours, guiding search teams silently with his movements and instincts. Rex had a record of success that spoke not in words but in results. And now, a 3-year-old had recognized the truth of his abilities without needing explanation. Ella's observation of Rex went beyond admiration. She noticed patterns. When witnesses hesitated or fumbled their words, Rex would shift slightly, adjusting his gaze toward them or the defendant. Ella's tiny body leaned forward, her fingers pointing at the dog, almost as if she were communicating silently with him. Her mother, Mrs. Reynolds, held her hand gently, whispering reassurances. She could see that Ella was aware of something deeper, something the adults in the room could not yet articulate. It was an intuitive connection, a bond between innocence and trained instinct. The ripple effect of this silent partnership began to influence the courtroom in subtle ways. The jurors leaned in more attentively, glancing at the dog occasionally. They were not consciously influenced by his presence, yet subconsciously, his calm vigilance lent weight to the proceedings. Even the defendant felt the silent pressure of observation. He could not escape the feeling that his actions were being scrutinized by more than human eyes. Every twitch, every subtle motion of Rex's body seemed to hold judgment, and Ella's focused gaze magnified that effect. Officer Davis had often marveled at the way Rex interacted with children. In parks, schools, and community events, the dog exhibited an unusual sensitivity toward young observers. He would sit quietly, allowing children to approach, recognizing their innocence and vulnerability. But in a courtroom, amidst tension and suspicion, the interaction with Ella was unprecedented. Here was a child whose awareness and perception matched, in subtle ways, the instincts of a trained police dog. Together, they formed a silent alliance of observation. Rex's previous cases illustrated the depth of his capabilities. In one high-profile narcotics operation, he had detected hidden contraband that human officers had failed to locate. In another, he had remained calm during a suspect's sudden outburst, restraining only by his presence, allowing officers to intervene safely. His instincts were precise, honed by years of careful training, and yet unpredictable in their subtlety. The courtroom, in that moment, was witnessing the culmination of years of skill, applied silently and noticed only by a child who could see beyond the obvious. Ella's whispers continued softly, "He sees it all," she said, her voice full of certainty. Her mother glanced down, astonished. "Honey, what do you mean?" she asked quietly. But Ella did not answer. Her gaze never left Rex, and she continued to observe the subtle changes in his posture, the flicker of his eyes, the movement of his tail. To her, the dog's presence was a guide, a teacher, a silent witness to the truths hidden beneath human words. The courtroom staff, oblivious to the full meaning, noticed a shift in energy. The defendant's unease grew with each movement of Rex and each whisper from Ella. Attorneys maintained professional composure, yet even they could not ignore the tension emanating from the front of the room. The subtle acknowledgement of the dog's capabilities and the child's perception created an atmosphere of quiet reverence, a recognition that justice sometimes relied on more than human words and evidence. As the next witness approached the stand, the sense of anticipation was palpable. Ella leaned forward, whispering again, "He knows the truth." Officer Davis adjusted Rex's leash subtly, a silent acknowledgement of the dog's alertness. The jury members, though trying to maintain neutrality, were affected by the quiet intensity. The child-dog dynamic was extraordinary, a phenomenon that no legal argument or procedural rule could fully explain. Rex's backstory, now quietly shared in whispers and subtle gestures, gave context to Ella's observations. Years of rigorous training, years of experience in law enforcement, and countless successful interventions had honed a presence that was both calm and authoritative. And Ella, in her innocent clarity, recognized that presence. She understood instinctively that this dog, trained and disciplined, could perceive truths invisible to ordinary human senses. Her 2 words earlier, "he knows," were not just playful babble, they were a profound acknowledgement of a silent intelligence at work in the courtroom. As the witness began recounting further details of the theft, Rex's ears twitched again. His nose lifted, catching the faintest scent of the defendant's nervous energy. Ella leaned forward, pointing once more. "He understands everything," she whispered. Mrs. Reynolds glanced around, half expecting someone to notice, but the adults remained focused on their papers and arguments. Only a few spectators quietly glanced at the child and the dog, sensing the extraordinary nature of the moment. By mid-afternoon, the ripple effect of this silent observation was undeniable. The courtroom, serious and formal, had been infused with a new layer of perception and awareness. Ella's insight, guided by innocence, and Rex's trained instincts created a partnership that few could articulate but all could feel. The defendant shifted uneasily, aware that his actions were being interpreted not just by humans, but by a keenly perceptive dog, and a child who could see what others could not. The trial pressed on, but the extraordinary connection between Ella and Rex remained at the forefront of attention. Witnesses continued, evidence was presented, and legal arguments were made. Yet the silent understanding between the child and the dog added a new, intangible dimension to the proceedings. Everyone in the courtroom, knowingly or not, was witnessing something rare, a moment where instinct, observation, and innocence revealed truths that formal testimony alone could not capture. And though the trial had hours yet to go, the subtle acknowledgement of Rex's capabilities, coupled with Ella's remarkable perception, ensured that the story of these 2 unusual observers would not soon be forgotten. The courtroom, serious and procedural as it was, had been transformed by the quiet interplay of intelligence, instinct, and childlike clarity. The ripple effect of those 2 words, "he knows," would continue to influence the proceedings in ways that no one could yet measure. The courtroom had grown unusually silent. Witnesses spoke, lawyers argued, and jurors scribbled notes, yet an invisible thread of tension had woven through the room. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those not paying close attention, but it was there. The quiet, commanding presence of Rex and the unwavering gaze of a small child perched on her mother's lap. Ella's eyes never left him. Every movement of his ears, every twitch of his tail, every subtle shift in posture seemed to carry meaning she alone understood. The defendant sat rigidly, trying to maintain composure, but his mind raced. The earlier remarks of the child, "he knows," still echoed in his thoughts. At first he had dismissed them as innocent babble, the whimsical musings of a 3-year-old. But now, hours into the trial, he could no longer ignore the effect. He felt observed, scrutinized in a way that transcended human evaluation. It wasn't just the jurors or the attorneys, it was the dog and somehow, the child who understood him. Attorney Simmons, the defense lawyer, shuffled papers nervously. He tried to regain the courtroom's focus on the evidence: security footage, eyewitness testimony, and the chain of custody for the stolen items. Yet even he felt a subtle shift in energy. His client's restless movements, the slight widening of eyes at subtle cues, and the way Rex seemed to track him, these were distractions he hadn't anticipated. Normally, courtroom strategy relied on words, evidence, and procedure. But here, instincts and perception were entering the mix. Ella, perched on her mother's lap, whispered quietly, "He's nervous." Mrs. Reynolds glanced down, unsure whether to intervene, but she could see it, her daughter was correct. The defendant's eyes darted nervously, his fingers tapping against the arm of the chair. Rex, calm and disciplined, remained a silent observer. To any casual observer, he was just a dog. But Ella noticed the small nuances: the flicker of his eyes toward the defendant, the subtle shift of weight, the slight inhale through his nose. She understood in ways words could not describe. Officer Davis, observing from the front, smiled faintly but kept his professional composure. He had trained Rex for years and had seen him read subtle cues, identify deception, and remain composed in high-pressure situations. But the combination of child and dog in this courtroom was unprecedented. Ella's observations mirrored Rex's trained instincts. Together, they created a silent narrative, one that influenced the energy of the room and, unknowingly, the perception of those present. The prosecution called a new witness, a security technician who had reviewed footage from the night of the theft. The video displayed grainy images of the defendant near the scene, his movements deliberate yet nervous. As the footage played, the defendant shifted in his chair. His confidence wavered under the silent scrutiny of two observers, a trained police dog and a child whose perception seemed uncanny. Ella leaned forward, pointing again at Rex. "He knows everything," she whispered softly. The courtroom buzzed quietly with curiosity. A few jurors exchanged glances, trying not to react, but they could not entirely suppress subtle reactions to the dynamic at the front. The judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, aware that something extraordinary was happening. "Let's proceed," he said, though the tone carried a hint of intrigue. Even he was captivated by the unusual interaction, sensing that the silent observation by Rex, amplified by Ella's perception, had added a new layer to the proceedings. The defendant's discomfort grew. He glanced at Rex repeatedly, feeling the dog's gaze follow him. Every movement, every twitch, every sigh was being recorded silently in the dog's memory. Ella's tiny hands continued to point, her brown eyes focused with intensity. It was as if she could read the room, read the people, and read the dog all at once. The combination of innocence and trained instinct had created a psychological pressure that even seasoned adults struggled to understand. Lawyers attempted to maintain formal procedure, asking technical questions and presenting evidence, but the tension was palpable. Witnesses hesitated slightly, sensing the unique energy in the room. Even spectators, seated quietly, leaned forward in their seats, curious about the unusual interplay between child and dog. The trial, normally a structured rhythm of questions and answers, had been subtly transformed into a stage where instinct, intuition, and perception were influencing the pace, tone, and even the emotional atmosphere. As the session continued, Ella whispered again, "He can't hide." Her mother's eyes widened. She glanced around, seeing the subtle shifts in the courtroom, the defendant's uneasy posture, the attentive jurors, the calm focus of Rex. It was clear that the words carried weight far beyond a child's casual observation. Officer Davis patted Rex gently, a silent acknowledgement that the dog's training, combined with the child's perception, was affecting the room in ways that were both extraordinary and undeniable. The defendant tried to focus on the witness, attempting to appear calm and composed. But each word, each gesture seemed scrutinized not only by the jury but by the silent observers at the front. The psychological impact was growing. The defendant's confidence faltered. His breathing became slightly more rapid, and his hands twitched subtly. Ella noticed immediately. "He's scared," she whispered softly, her perception of Rex's subtle signals confirming the truth of her observation. The courtroom remained silent, yet tension had deepened. The judge noticed the change, the jury observed it, and even the lawyers felt it. Words alone could not capture the weight of the moment. Ella's innocent observations and Rex's trained instincts combined to create a force of attention that influenced every participant, even unconsciously. It was an unspoken reminder that sometimes perception, quiet, attentive, instinctual, could reveal more than evidence, testimony, or argument. Officer Davis whispered to the judge, maintaining professionalism while acknowledging the dog's unique contribution. "Rex senses the truth," he said softly. The judge nodded, intrigued. He had presided over countless trials, yet few had included such an unusual witness, one whose presence was silent, yet impactful. The child, perched on her mother's lap, had recognized the dog's abilities immediately. Together, they created an invisible force in the courtroom, affecting perception, attention, and the flow of the trial. Witnesses continued to speak, but the courtroom's energy had changed. Each statement seemed to carry more weight. Jurors leaned in, subconsciously noting the defendant's discomfort. The spectators whispered quietly, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Ella's whispers punctuated the rhythm of the proceedings. "He knows, he can see, he understands." Her mother held her hand gently, amazed by her daughter's perception. Even the defendant recognized it now. He shifted in his chair, feeling the quiet scrutiny of both child and dog. Words could not alleviate the pressure. The courtroom's rhythm, normally dictated by human procedure, had been subtly altered. Every movement, every gesture, every glance now carried a silent commentary. Rex, trained to observe and respond to subtle cues, had become an unseen force in the room, amplified by the perception of a child who understood instinct in ways adults could not. By mid-afternoon, the tension had become almost palpable. Witnesses proceeded cautiously, jurors exchanged silent glances, and even the lawyers adjusted their demeanor slightly, aware of the unusual energy in the room. Ella continued to observe, her small hands pointing, her brown eyes alert. She did not speak loudly, but every whisper carried meaning, reflecting her understanding of Rex's silent observations. The courtroom was no longer just a venue for human judgment. It had become a theater of instinct, perception, and quiet awareness. And though the trial had many hours to go, the ripple effect of Ella's observations and Rex's trained instincts ensured that the story unfolding in that courtroom would be remembered. The quiet tension, the subtle scrutiny, and the extraordinary perception of a child and a dog had transformed the trial into something far more profound than anyone expected. A living reminder that insight can come from the most unexpected sources. The courtroom felt heavier now, as though every breath, every shuffle of papers, carried a subtle weight. Witnesses had testified, evidence had been presented, and arguments had been made. Yet the room's energy had shifted irreversibly. It was no longer just a matter of facts and legal procedure. The silent partnership between a 3-year-old child and a trained police dog had introduced a layer of perception that was impossible to ignore. Ella's wide eyes never left Rex, and the dog's gaze remained fixed, steady, and alert. Together, they seemed to communicate a silent message that the courtroom could almost feel, though not yet fully understand. The defendant sat stiffly in his chair, his hands tightly clasped together. His confident demeanor had eroded slowly throughout the trial, worn down by the subtle yet persistent awareness of the dog and the child. He had experienced interrogations, cross-examinations, and scrutiny from lawyers and judges before, but never like this. It was not a human evaluation alone. It was instinct, intuition, and unspoken understanding combined. Every small twitch of Rex's ears, every subtle glance, and every whisper from Ella magnified his growing unease. The jury filed quietly into the box, their faces serious but tinged with curiosity. They had been attentive throughout the trial, but even they could not ignore the unusual dynamic at the front of the room. Most jurors had been focused on evidence, testimony, and procedural rules. Yet they had begun to sense an unspoken narrative forming. The presence of an intelligent, trained police dog and the perceptive insight of a small child had created a psychological undercurrent that influenced perception in ways beyond the written law. Ella shifted slightly on her mother's lap, leaning forward with unyielding focus. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "He's scared now." Mrs. Reynolds glanced down, astonished. She hadn't yet learned how much her child truly understood, but the accuracy of Ella's observation was undeniable. Officer Davis, standing near Rex, exchanged a quiet look with the judge. The child's perception was uncanny. She seemed to understand the dog's instincts and the defendant's subtle cues in ways that most adults could not even imagine. The prosecution began its closing statement, carefully recounting the evidence presented during the trial. Security footage, eyewitness testimony, and forensic analysis were detailed with precision. Yet even as the lawyer spoke, the room's energy subtly acknowledged a different truth, one that was communicated silently through glances, posture, and instinct. Rex remained still, but every subtle shift of his body spoke volumes, observed keenly by Ella, whose small hands occasionally pointed in affirmation of the dog's assessment. The defendant's lawyer rose to present the defense's closing argument. He spoke with deliberate care, attempting to highlight inconsistencies in witness statements and potential alternate explanations. But even he was aware of the quiet pressure in the room, an unspoken scrutiny emanating from the front where the child and the dog sat. Words that normally carried authority now felt measured against an invisible standard. The defendant fidgeted again, glancing at Rex, whose unwavering gaze seemed to suggest awareness beyond what words could articulate. Ella's whispers continued, soft and precise. "He knows," she said again, this time louder, as though emphasizing the truth she had perceived from the beginning. Mrs. Reynolds tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, both nervous and awed. The jurors, while maintaining composure, noticed the unusual energy, sensing the defendant's growing discomfort. The courtroom, already tense, had become a stage for an extraordinary interplay of perception, intuition, and awareness. The judge cleared his throat, ready to address the jury. "Members of the jury, you have heard all the evidence and arguments. It is now your responsibility to deliberate and reach a verdict based on the facts presented." He paused, looking briefly at Rex and then at Ella. There was an unspoken acknowledgement. The presence of this child and this dog had transformed the courtroom in subtle yet profound ways. They had introduced an element that transcended standard procedure, a quiet influence rooted in perception and instinct. As the jury filed into the deliberation room, the courtroom held its collective breath. Witnesses returned to their seats, lawyers straightened their notes, and the defendant sat with tense composure, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Rex. The dog remained still, observing quietly, exuding calm authority. Ella, still perched on her mother's lap, whispered softly, "He can't lie." Mrs. Reynolds swallowed hard, realizing that the child's words carried the same certainty she had seen reflected in the dog's behavior. Outside the jury room, a quiet murmur spread among spectators. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the unusual interaction between child and dog. "A 3-year-old and a police dog influencing a trial," one whispered. "I've never seen anything like it," replied another. The courtroom staff, accustomed to procedural normalcy, exchanged glances, acknowledging that something remarkable had taken place. The energy in the room was no longer solely about evidence. It was about perception, instinct, and truth observed through extraordinary eyes. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The jury's deliberation was intense, thorough, and meticulous. Yet beneath the layers of legal reasoning, there was an undeniable influence. The silent observation of Rex, validated by Ella's perceptive whispers. The child's instincts had aligned perfectly with the dog's trained awareness, creating a presence that even the jury, consciously or not, felt as they evaluated the evidence and testimony. Finally, the foreperson of the jury returned to the courtroom. The room fell silent. The defendant's hands trembled slightly, betraying the confidence he had attempted to maintain. Ella leaned forward, whispering, "He's done now." Her mother glanced down, unsure what her daughter meant. Officer Davis tightened his grip on Rex's leash subtly, sensing that the culmination of the trial and the extraordinary observations that had influenced it was at hand. The foreperson cleared her throat. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a verdict." The judge nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Please read the verdict," he instructed. The courtroom leaned forward collectively, aware that the moment had arrived. The defendant's lawyer's face paled slightly, while the prosecution's team straightened in anticipation. Even the spectators, accustomed to the pace of legal proceedings, felt the room's tension spike. The foreperson's voice echoed clearly. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged." The words hung in the air. The courtroom exhaled collectively, some with relief, some with astonishment. The defendant slumped slightly, unable to maintain his composure. Yet there was a deeper resonance to the moment that went beyond the legal outcome. The judgment felt, in a subtle way, validated not only by evidence but by instinct, perception, and the quiet observation of those who had seen what others could not. Ella's eyes sparkled with quiet triumph. She leaned back against her mother, whispering, "He knew." Mrs. Reynolds smiled softly, heart swelling with pride. Rex remained composed, yet there was a subtle relaxation in his posture. His job in this silent but critical capacity was complete. Together, the child and the dog had witnessed, understood, and silently influenced the courtroom in a way no one expected. The judge adjourned the court, signaling the end of proceedings. Lawyers gathered their papers, spectators murmured quietly, and the defendant was escorted out, subdued and defeated. Yet for those who had witnessed the interaction between a small child and a police dog, the trial had become more than a legal proceeding. It had become a testament to the power of observation, perception, and the extraordinary connection between innocence and trained instinct. Outside the courtroom, reporters rushed to capture every detail. The story of a 3-year-old and a police dog who had, together, observed truths hidden from adult eyes would spread rapidly. Interviews with Officer Davis, Mrs. Reynolds, and even the jurors highlighted the remarkable nature of the bond. Ella's nose would be quoted widely, symbolizing the extraordinary clarity and insight of a child paired with the trained instincts of a devoted police dog. The courthouse slowly emptied, but the energy of the day lingered like a charged current. Reporters swarmed outside, phones raised, notebooks scribbling, cameras clicking. The story of a 3-year-old girl, Ella, who had pointed at a police dog and said 2 simple words, "He knows," had already begun spreading through the city, capturing the attention of the public. News outlets called it extraordinary, social media exploded with curiosity and admiration, and viewers everywhere marveled at the unlikely duo that had silently influenced a courtroom. Inside, Mrs. Reynolds carefully guided Ella down the steps, holding her tiny hand. "Honey, you were amazing today," she whispered, marveling at her daughter's calm confidence. Ella, still wide-eyed but proud, whispered back softly, "He helped me." Her small words reflected the bond she had formed with Rex, the dog who had served faithfully in law enforcement and whose quiet observation had guided her instincts throughout the trial. It was a moment of mutual understanding between child and animal, one that adults could sense, but only partly grasp. Officer Davis walked beside them, his tall frame protective and measured. "You two make quite the team," he said with a smile, patting Rex's head gently. Rex responded with a slight tilt of his ears, a subtle acknowledgement of praise. The officer's pride was evident. He had trained Rex for years, and while he knew of the dog's skills, he had never imagined the dog's instincts would align so perfectly with a child's perception in such a high-pressure situation. It was extraordinary, a testament to training, intuition, and the innocence of a perceptive child. News vans lined the street outside, cameras pointed toward the courthouse. Reporters clamored for interviews with witnesses, jurors, and, of course, Ella's mother. "How did your daughter know?" one reporter asked eagerly. Mrs. Reynolds smiled, a little overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "She has a remarkable sense of observation," she replied. "And Rex, well, he's extraordinary. Together, they notice things most adults couldn't see." Ella, perched in her mother's arms, waved shyly at the cameras, unaware of just how much of a sensation she had become. Back inside, the defendant was being led away by officers. His shoulders slumped, and his confidence had completely eroded. He knew he had been outmatched, not just by the evidence and the law, but by the quiet power of observation, instinct, and perception. The dog's presence had been a constant, silent reminder that deception could not hide from trained awareness, and the child's words had amplified that silent judgment, creating a psychological weight impossible to dismiss. It was a defeat that was both legal and, in an unspoken way, moral. In the days that followed, the story of Ella and Rex went viral. News stations ran features on the trial, highlighting the unusual and heartwarming connection between the child and the dog. Opinion pieces debated the impact of instinct and perception in the justice system. Social media was filled with posts praising Ella's courage and intelligence, and lauding Rex's years of dedicated service. Memes, videos, and articles celebrated the duo, emphasizing the uncanny alignment between a child's innocent perception and a dog's trained instincts. Officer Davis, now a minor celebrity himself, gave interviews explaining Rex's background, his training, and the remarkable ability to read human behavior. "Rex has been trained for years to notice subtle cues, fear, deceit, and intent," he explained. "What's extraordinary is that Ella, in her own way, recognized the same things. It was like they were speaking the same language without words." The story captured hearts nationwide, blending human curiosity, emotional intelligence, and the extraordinary capabilities of a working dog. The courtroom itself became a place of legend in local circles. Lawyers, judges, and law enforcement officers spoke of the trial for months afterward, recounting how a 3-year-old and a dog had quietly influenced the perception of everyone present. The jury's decision, already rooted in evidence, had been reinforced by the silent, intuitive presence of observers few adults had fully comprehended. The story became a case study in perception, intuition, and the ways innocence can reveal truth. Meanwhile, Ella's mother noticed subtle changes in her daughter. She seemed more confident, more attuned to her surroundings. People often smiled at her, recognizing the child who had, in her own way, contributed to justice. At home, Ella played quietly with Rex, mimicking what she had observed in court. She whispered softly to him during play, as if confirming that he truly understood the world in ways others couldn't. The bond between the child and the dog had deepened, forged not in formal training, but in shared observation, trust, and mutual respect. Rex, now widely recognized as a hero, continued his duties on the force but with a sense of pride and accomplishment. Officer Davis made sure to give him extra care, longer walks, favorite treats, and gentle pats, acknowledging that the dog had not only performed his official duties but had influenced a historic courtroom moment. For Rex, it was part of the job, silent and unobtrusive. Yet the acknowledgement from humans and the deep respect from a child gave the dog a quiet sense of fulfillment that no one could measure but those who understood the subtle language of instinct and trust. Months later, the courthouse held a small ceremony honoring Rex's service. Ella was invited as a guest of honor, proudly holding a small medal in her hands. Photographs captured the image of the tiny child standing beside the powerful dog, both gazing forward with calm awareness. Officer Davis spoke to the gathered audience, recounting the trial and emphasizing the importance of observation, trust, and teamwork between humans and animals. The story was both heartwarming and extraordinary, inspiring everyone present. The public reaction continued to grow. Schools invited Ella and her mother for talks about observation, courage, and understanding animals. Community centers used the story as a teaching moment about teamwork and perception. Articles in magazines and newspapers highlighted the unlikely duo, focusing on the broader lessons. Sometimes, truth reveals itself in unexpected ways, and the innocence of a child can align perfectly with the instincts of a trained animal. The courtroom episode had transcended legal boundaries, becoming a story of inspiration and fascination. Years later, the tale of Ella and Rex remained part of local legend. Lawyers told it to remind new colleagues about the unpredictable nature of courtrooms. Children heard the story in schools, learning that attention, observation, and courage can reveal truths adults may overlook. Rex eventually retired from active duty, living peacefully with Officer Davis, while Ella grew into a curious, perceptive young girl who never forgot the lessons she had learned. Observation matters, instincts are powerful, and sometimes, even the smallest voice can be heard when it speaks with truth. The courtroom had been the setting of a remarkable moment, a convergence of instinct, perception, and innocence. And although the trial was over, the story of the two-word proclamation, "He knows," and the bond between a child and a police dog would echo for years to come. It became a testament to the extraordinary potential of the unseen, the subtle, and the intuitive, a reminder that sometimes justice, clarity, and understanding emerge not only through formal procedures, but also through the quiet, perceptive eyes of those willing to see what others cannot.